Hey folks, welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today we are going to be painting up some figures from Rune Wars. Now, this is from their core box set. These are the skeletons. I'm going to be using them for D&D, as I've already got a set to use for the game. However, I wanted to go ahead and paint these in what I refer to as an assembly line paint job. That's where we try to paint all of the same color across all of the miniatures all at once, and then we move on to the next color. You'll find that when you're doing large batch painting like this, that you actually paint a lot faster than if you were to paint every individual model at once. You'll also get a much more cohesive paint scheme across the entire army, as you should be doing everything all at once instead of trying to remember what you did on the previous miniature. Whenever I go live, one of the biggest things I get asked is, do you have advice for new miniature painters? And one of the biggest pieces of advice I like to give is to try to work from the lowest layer outward. That way you cover up your mistakes as you go. Now, I don't always follow this advice. Sometimes I can see things that I think will be easier to paint right away, and so I do things a little out of order. And that's something that's going to come with some experience. So let's go ahead and apply that to today's project. Since we're going to be painting an entire army worth of miniatures, it's important to assembly line paint this. So you're going to want to do all the same color across all the miniatures all at once. This is going to help you save some time. It's not going to feel like it in the short term, but in the long term, you'll realize you painted a lot more quickly than you would have if you painted them all one at a time. So we're going to be starting out with gunmetal from Vallejo. Now, any kind of dark silver will work just fine, and anything metal is going to get painted this. Now, there are some things that I want to do gold, and we'll do that later on, so that's why I'm not going to be painting like the band on the shield or some of the stripes on the shoulder pauldrons, but you want to just go ahead and do everything in that dark gunmetal that you think you want to have any kind of silver colors or any kind of dark metal colors. So the armor, the chainmail, anything like that, go ahead and paint that silver now. Choosing a hero color can be a little bit tricky. Now, what I mean by hero color is, what do you want the primary color to be when you look at the miniature? Now, in my case, I want to go ahead and paint these guys red. Red can oftentimes be a villain color, but it can also be a color that represents royalty. And since I'm going to be using these guys for Dungeons and Dragons more than I'll be using them from Rune Wars, I want to choose a color that isn't going to constantly make them immediately look like a bad guy, even though they're undead. So I'm choosing red, and we're just going to go ahead and paint all of the fabric in red. Now, there's some around the waist, and there's this cape, and there are a few other places that are fabric, but I end up painting those to look like they're made of metal. That's just a personal choice of mine. But you want to go ahead and get a nice all-over coat. Now, you may decide that you want to put a wash and some highlights on this, and if that's the case, just use a slightly darker wash than what your base coat is, and then use your base coat as your first layer of highlights, and then a step above that as your extreme highlights, and they should turn out pretty nice. Now, in my case, I'm not going to be doing that, as I want to just go ahead and get these guys all painted up, and in all cases, I'm probably going to be using these guys as cannon fodder, which means they're probably not going to be on the table all that long, so I'm not super concerned about them looking really crazy nice, which is one of the reasons we're just using a lot of contrast paint in this paint scheme. Even though I'm not personally a big fan of contrast paints, I think this is a great way to use them. Moving on to wood and leather colors. I'm actually going to be using the exact same contrast paint. I'm going to be using Go Gunther Fur, I believe is how you say it, and the trick with this color is the lighter you put it on, the more leather-like it has an appearance, and the darker you put it on and the more saturated it is, the more likely it is to look like wood. This is one of my favorite contrast paints, and in my opinion, it works exactly how I think contrast paint should always work, and not all of the colors work this nicely, but it is one of my favorite examples of contrast and speed paint type of stuff working really well and working to your advantage. Now here I'm just fixing up these like forearm bracers. Now I wasn't 100% sure if I wanted to divide them up. You'll see if you look real close that they have two parts. There's an internal part that is most likely meant to be a leather color, and there's an external metal part. And I have decided to just paint them all in the metal color for simplicity's sake. And that is a choice that I am making for ease of painting and speed to ensure that I will be able to paint as many of these miniatures in as small a time as possible. Another thing you'll probably notice is that many of the other colors that we have already painted are still wet on the miniature. This is one of the many advantages to painting from the lowest layer out. We're not just covering up mistakes as we go, but we can keep painting and we don't have to sit around and wait for things to dry. Speaking of dry, the metallics that we've already put down should be more than dry to go ahead and start layering up our gold. So just to add a little bit of interest, I'm picking out some of the detail on these leg pieces here, and I'm just painting some gold stripes on them, and that's really going to help to kind of make the model pop a little bit more. In my opinion, they kind of make these skeletons look like as though in life, perhaps, they were a little bit more important than just your average soldier. And then in addition to that, I'm also going to be picking out the shoulder pauldrons. As in my D&D campaign, the primary color of the faction that they will be belonging to is red and gold. So I want to make sure that that gold is out in public view and kind of on display, so to speak. Now at this point, go ahead and take some time to clean up any minor mistakes that you may have. Now, if you've got some mistakes involving contrast paints, you might have to get some similar colors out to fix them. I recommend using techniques like glazing. If you're not familiar with glazing, kind of go somewhere slightly above a wash-like consistency and add a few layers until things start to blend in. If you're having an issue fixing any mistakes on bone, like what you see on the head of my skeleton, then you can just go ahead and use a dry brushing technique with a similar gray or white, and you can get it pretty close. Now it's important to do this because our next couple of stages here are going to involve us using a lot of color in a lot of places. We're going to be doing the bone, and our second stage of the bone, we actually want to wash the entire miniature. Using Skeletal Horde, we're going to go ahead and put this all over the miniature. Now, if you don't have something like Skeletal Horde, I recommend doing a 50-50 mix of Agras Earthshade as well as Seraphim Sepia. Now, it's not going to be a perfect match, but it's going to be close. And you may even want to dry brush more of an Ushabti bone color down first before you put that wash mixture on, and you should end up in the ballpark of what we're doing here. Now, you may need to put down 2 of these bone washes just to get a thickness or a darkness that you like, where the recesses are nice and dark but the highlights aren't too bright. Now I typically focus my second wash on the head of the miniature as well as the feet for some reason. With them being as small as they are and with the head being as large as it is, you end up with these really bright patches, so I like to darken that up with a second wash. Now, not unlike Army Shader Quick Shade, we're going to actually be using Agrax Earthshade across the entire miniature, and you can go as heavy or as light as you want to. Understand that the heavier you go, the more it's going to look like it's dirty and grimy. So if you want these guys to look super dirty and grimy, go ahead and do that. Now there is a grime contrast paint, and if you want to do that as well, I recommend going sparingly after you Agrax Earthshade the entire miniature. And that is going to help make things look nice and dirty, make these guys look really old, and it's also going to really deepen up the bone. It's going to make them look like they've been out in the weather a lot, and it's going to make them look either like they've been in the ground for a long time or they've been out animated for a long time. Now, if you want your skeletons to look a little more kept after, like a necromancer has been actually taking care of them, you may want to go back in and do some dry brushing on the bone to brighten up the bone a little bit, and to do some edge highlights all the way around on all of the colors, and just leave this wash in the deepest recesses. But honestly, I think it looks really great just putting it all over everything, and I think the final result really speaks for itself. Finally, if you have any kind of gemstones or jewels on your character, go ahead and pick a secondary color. Now in my case, I chose green because it's complementary to red, and it is going to take a couple of coats to put this on over top of the gold and any other brighter colors that I have put on the miniature, but it's worth the effort. And one of the last things I like to do for these dirty, grimy skeleton guys is I'm just going to go ahead and come in with Tolerant Sand, and I'm just going to go ahead and pick out around the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and just kind of brighten things up a little bit. If you wanted to take this to a bit more of an extreme, you could go in with some Ushapti bone afterward and really pick out some edge highlights. And if you want to do like a glowing eye effect, you can just put a little dot of white dead center in the middle of the eye, dry brush a little bit around the edge of the eye with white, and then use a contrast paint or a wash of your choice to turn that into whatever color glowing effect that you want. For these guys, I'm not really going to mess around with that. I don't really like the glowing eye look on skeletons, so I don't tend to do it, but to each their own. Now, something you guys have probably noticed throughout the course of me painting this miniature is I've completely ignored the base. Now, the reason for that is that this game actually comes with these awesome slotted bases. They're kind of like a movement tray from Warhammer Age of Sigmar or Warhammer Fantasy, and that's kind of what they were inspired by. And what they allow you to do is they allow you to take multiple units and put them on the same base, and then take multiple bases and slot them together so that you can move an entire army across the table all at once. Now, the reason I'm ignoring the base in today's video is I actually want to paint these slotted bases so that they all kind of look the same and that they are congruent, so that when you add the miniature to the slotted base, you will be able to, or the movement tray, I shouldn't call it a slotted base, but when you add the miniature to a movement tray, the movement tray will also have the same ground texture as the base. And I want to make a video talking about how I decorate these movement trays so that they kind of blend in with the miniatures, so that no matter what miniatures you're using on these bases, that they will kind of blend in so long as they are designed to go with these movement trays. And I think that would be a really fun video all on its own. It probably won't be a whole 10-minute video like I normally try to shoot for, but I think it's a good subject to put all on its own. So that's why we haven't done any basing. If you could care less about movement trays and you're just painting a group of skeletons to use for your D&D game, or some skeletons for Warhammer, and you don't plan to have a bunch of them and you don't plan to use movement trays, then you could just go ahead and use some basing paste, put a little dry brush on top of that, and you'll end up with something pretty nice. Now, with undead miniatures, a lot of winter tufts tend to look really nice with them. A lot of dry, dead grasses tend to look really nice, but ultimately that is your choice on how you want to base them. That's just how I would do it if I wasn't planning to do this movement tray system. In any case, let's go ahead and see the final result. I'll show you all of the other skeletons that I've already painted up. I still have to paint the rest of the army, but I wanted to go ahead and make a video while I was about partway through this to just kind of show my process. Hopefully you guys took something away from this and you really like the way that I tackle assembly line painting. And that's gonna wrap things up. This is how I used to do things before Slapchop came along. This is like my version of Slapchop. Is it as fast as Slapchop? Absolutely not. This took me about 20 minutes per miniature while making a video about it, so maybe call it 15 minutes per miniature. But in a single Saturday, yeah, you could pump out an entire box set for Rune Wars, and it wouldn't be a big deal. It actually is a lot of fun. Put on some anime or a good TV show or something and just kill the afternoon and have some fun painting. I think the assembly line process works really well for doing stuff like this, and I think it's just a tiny bit above the Slapchop method, even though we kind of start in the same ballpark. In any case, guys, I hope you really enjoyed today's video, and without further ado, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.